Welcome to the Sage Planning Solutions Podcast. Join us as we help you navigate life's financial obstacles and find financial freedom. We will cover the major pitfalls that can derail your journey to financial independence. Get ready to learn, grow, and prepare for your best possible financial future.
Securities and advisory services offered through Cateray Grant & Company Incorporated, a registered investment advisor and member FINRA SIPC. Cateray Grant and Sage Planning Solutions are separate and unaffiliated entities. The information provided here is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered an individualized recommendation or personalized investment advice. Any opinions or forecasts contained herein reflect the subjective judgments and assumptions of the authors only and do not necessarily reflect the views of Cateray Grant & Company Incorporated. Investing is subject to risks, including loss of principal invested. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. No strategy can assure a profit nor protect against loss. This information is not intended to be a substitute for specific individualized tax, legal, or investment planning advice. Neither Cateray Grant & Company Incorporated nor its registered representatives or employees provide tax or legal services. Please note that individual situations can vary. Therefore, the information should be relied upon when coordinated with individual professional advice.
Bob, thank you for joining us again. We really appreciate it. How are you?
You're welcome. Terrific to be here today.
So I'd like to start off with some follow-up questions from our previous podcast back in June. Two questions. Since there was a Republican sweep, one, what policy changes do you think would be most impactful for economic growth and the markets going forward? And what are some of the challenges that the U.S. faces heading into 2025?
Wow. I can talk about all that stuff for the next 20 minutes, but I'll try to keep it confined and narrow and limited. So we're likely to see an extension, not a permanent extension, but a partial extension, I should say temporary extension of the tax cuts originally enacted 7 years ago under President Trump. I'm expecting an extension of maybe 4, 5, 6 years. So it'll be similar to what we enacted in 2017. There'll be a sunset several years later. And then whether or not they sunset will depend on how the public votes in the following election or two. I also think those tax cuts might be deepened a little bit. And by deepened, that means maybe taking the corporate rate, which used to be 35 pre-Trump, he cut it originally to 21, maybe down to 18%. He's talked publicly about maybe reducing it to 15%. Given our budget constraints, I think that's probably a bridge too far, and we'll probably reach a stopping point of something like 18%. However, there's a big difference between cutting the corporate rate from 35 to 21, then much bigger difference between that and cutting it from 21 to 18. 21 to 18 is no big deal. It really isn't. So I don't think that's going to stimulate any extra economic growth. Where I do think President Trump's policies and the Republican policies in general will stimulate more economic growth is the slowdown in the process of regulation and the repeal of many regulations that already exist, particularly in the energy sector. I think we're going to be a little more forceful in terms of drilling permits, more aggressive in terms of hubs to export liquefied natural gas, which should stimulate more production of natural gas in the United States. I think we're going to be a little more aggressive about nuclear energy, and we'll probably deregulate generally in the environmental space. Not every area, but I think there'll be a lighter touch in many areas. And also, even if Harris had been elected instead of Trump, some of that was going to happen anyhow. Just some of it, not all of it, some of it. And the reason some of it was going to happen is because of a court case last year, the Loper-Bright case, which basically made it a little tougher for federal agencies to regulate to their heart's content and not have the courts review those regulations to see if they're consistent with what Congress allowed those agencies to do in the first place. So combination of that, a little bit of the tax cutting, but more in the deregulatory agenda should help stimulate economic growth in the years ahead. Doesn't necessarily mean the next year will be growing faster than the past year or two, because the unemployment rate is already low. The economic expansion is older than it had been. But over the long term, it will boost economic growth a little bit.
Thank you for that. I think that I was talking to Pat yesterday, actually, regarding energy. And energy looks, after its massive run in 2022, it looks like a big consolidation, and now it looks like it's ready for its next leg higher. And I can see, I'm looking underneath the hood of each of the industries within the energy sector, I can see a lot of money being put into oil and gas, exploration, MLPs, to name a few. Is that some of the thesis that you guys have at First Trust heading into 2025?
This is a fantastic question, but I have to tell you, I'm not the investment strategist at First Trust. So there are other very bright minds at First Trust who can walk you through on that. But I'm kind of more of a big picture macroeconomist rather than a sector by sector analyst of what's going on, and particularly in the energy sector. I mean, I could fake it. I could fake it like Jim Cramer does, where he pretends to be an expert on every topic. Have you ever seen Jim Cramer get a question and say, I really don't know a lot about that topic. So-and-so knows a little bit more about this topic. He never answers that way. Okay, that's why you have reverse Kramers and people betting, the opposite of what he says. I have an area of expertise, and if it's outside my area, I'm happy to punt.
Okay, so let's say on the macro front, how do you view the trajectory of the U.S.-China trade relations, considering the recent election?
They've gotten worse, and they're only going to get worse from here. They're going to get worse faster under Donald Trump than they would have under Vice President Harris. But I don't expect the next president, who starts in 2029, the next president is obviously Donald Trump. But the president after that might be a Democrat. Whatever Trump does, they're not going to wholesale repeal what he does over the next 4 years. And the reason is because how would you feel? How would you do politically if you're the president and you go easier and lighter on China, and then all of a sudden they invade Taiwan? No matter what any president inherits, regardless of what they say during their campaign, they're going to keep the pressure on China. So what I anticipate with Trump vis-a-vis China is we do go to 50 or 60% tariffs on China over the next year or so. And the amount of trade that the mainland Chinese does with the United States is going to dwindle drastically over the next couple of years.
The previous podcast, you had mentioned reshoring manufacturing. So I was looking, just reading up on that. Now, what industries do you see benefiting from this shift?
Yeah, the industries that are going to reshore the most are the industries that part of the reshoring is going to just be movement away from China. Okay, so is toy production going to come to the USA? No. Toy production is going to go to India, Indonesia, Vietnam, maybe Mexico. It's not going to come back to the USA. What I do expect is that production that is now occurring in Taiwan will come to the U.S. in the form of chip production. And that's going to increase substantially in the years ahead, in part through the CHIPS Act, because it's a government policy, and I think to some extent it's bipartisan, to reduce the amount of chip dependence on Taiwan over the next several years, just in case China does invade Taiwan. The U.S. wouldn't be as dependent on Taiwan as some other places around the world.
What is the one thing, and again, this is getting back to sort of the way that you called the election some months ago, and you talked about percentage chances of Republican sweeps and things. What is the one thing that you think, is it possible for us to get landmark legislation done in the next couple, 3 years to where the country will set itself up in a position where they could actually attack the deficit, they can attack spending, they can attack exporting of our dollars?
So I think the biggest landmark legislation in terms of fiscal or budget legislation that's going to happen over the next couple of years is some sort of block granting of Medicaid, not Medicare for senior citizens, not Social Security, but Medicaid for low-income folks, and that includes a lot of Obamacare. It's going to be block granted to the states, and the states will kind of sort that program out. Now, in the early stages, that's not really going to save us any money. But by letting the states experiment with reform and, frankly, gradually squeeze that program over time for budget savings, over a very long period of time, like literally over the next 30 years, it could save us present value an enormous amount of money. So you're not going to see it like move the needle on the budget deficit over the next few years, but eventually it moves the needle a lot. So that to me would be the biggest landmark piece of legislation. But again, we're not going to feel it right away. Okay, it's not going to like be night and day right away. The other major potential action, and it's really not legislation here, is that it appears like Donald Trump and his administration will try to revive something called the impoundment power, which has sat there dormant for the past 50 years. Okay, and pretty much every president between Thomas Jefferson and Nixon would periodically use impoundment to save the taxpayer some money. But Nixon was politically weakened during Watergate, and he had been using it very aggressively against Democrats on Capitol Hill to save money by taking money out of their districts and states. And so Congress passed something to strip him and all future presidents of this power of impoundment. But no president has really challenged it up to the Supreme Court, whether or not Congress can take this power away by passing a law, or do they have to do a constitutional amendment, which, by the way, they never did. Okay, so Donald Trump not being shy of a courtroom, obviously. He's been in and out of courtrooms for the past, I don't know, 50 some odd years. I think he would challenge it. He's going to refuse to spend money that Congress has appropriated for some program somewhere. And the beneficiaries of that program are going to sue the federal government. And he's going to say, sorry, you can't make me do this. And it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court over the next couple of years. And I think the Supreme Court may very well restore the power of impoundment. Now, that's not going to balance the budget, but it means both Trump and all future presidents have the power unilaterally to cut some spending. Now, it's not going to cut Social Security, Medicare. It's not going to cut Medicaid. You can't cut interest on the debt. You can't cut entitlements, but you can go after discretionary programs, the money that has to be appropriated, or you have to have Congress pass a law each year to spend it. That the president will have more power to cut unilaterally. Not just Trump, but future presidents. And that would be a sea change in the way budgeting is done in the USA.
Can that counterbalance congressional appropriations?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is a big if, okay? Because I'm not an oracle. I don't know which way the Supreme Court would rule on this. I've heard arguments on both sides. I lean ever so slightly on the side that they will say, no, impoundment still exists. It's just that nobody's used it for the past 50 years, okay? But they never passed a constitutional amendment. He can still do it. It really changes the balance of power on spending issues, and potentially some other issues too, between the president and Congress. Because what happens is this: Congress can pass an annual appropriation set of bills, the president can sign them, and then he can immediately renege and say, I don't like this program, I don't like that program, I don't like the other program. So it's not like a line item veto generally, but it would be a line item veto in effect for discretionary annual spending bills, just for those discretionary annual spending bills. It's almost like giving him a line item veto.
Would Congress think that's like undermining their authority?
Absolutely, 100%. But there's nothing they could do about it. And so it also means, to some extent, it's going to be tougher to sustain the political coalition that supports big discretionary spending, because you can never pre-commit. Congress gets together in the future, they pass a spending bill, and they cobble that compromise together because they say, okay, you want this and I want that, and we'll just spend them both, and we'll kind of roll in the money, kind of like those guys did in one of the last episodes of Breaking Bad. They're in the warehouse thing, they're rolling on the money, but they can't do that anymore. It's like, because they can't pre-commit the president to accept their compromise. And the president could say, yeah, all good, sign it into law, and then, no, I don't want that, I don't want that. And, oh, by the way, that congressman over there with this project in his districts, he's voting against my bill to fight crime. I don't like that. And so, to heck with his district, I'm throwing them under the bus. I'm not doing that spending project in his district. The whole political coalition dynamic changes.
So is that kind of like they would view it as an abuse of power?
Yes. The coalition that favors big discretionary spending every year will completely resort to that and say it's an abuse of power. Absolutely. So here's how presidents pre-Nixon, between Thomas Jefferson and Nixon, would describe it. They would say Congress has the power of the purse, which means Congress has the ability to hand the president a purse with a lot of money in it. That's the power of the purse. But you can't make the president spend the money. For the past 50 years, it's been the power of the purse means Congress passes a bill and the president signs it. He's got a big pocketbook or wallet full of money, and he must spend it. So if this proceeds like I think it might, sometime over the next couple of years, Supreme Court says no, power of impoundment. Well, the power of the purse goes back to the old concept. You can hand the president a purse with money in it. You can say you can spend up to this amount, but you can't make him spend a penny of it. It just means the president is limited in the amount of money he can spend in it, but you can't make him spend any more than zero. Okay, totally. So it just changes the dynamic.
With that policy disruption, how does that affect the programs?
It makes it very hard for the beneficiaries to rely on those discretionary programs over time, because you might get it 1 year, but it might not be there 2 years from now. And so my guess is it reduces the amount of lobbying in DC for these pet projects, because you never know. You can put in all this effort into sweet talking some congressman and making the appropriate donations to their campaign funds. to get them to put it in the bill, and the president could just on a whim take it out. And so I think that would help drain the swamp in DC. If you want to reduce the amount of sweet talking lobbyists who raise money for campaign contributions for individual legislators and senators and congressmen, this is one way to do it.
That was the direction I was going. How is it going to affect lobbying? Because, I mean, that line of questioning, I was trying to get to that point.
Yeah, my neighbors who are lobbyists might be looking for new jobs. So being the warm-hearted guy I am, I will definitely offer them, if they want to mow my lawn, if they want to come in and clean my house, maybe deliver some firewood to my property, that would be fine. But I think society generally would look at those as much higher value services than the stuff they're doing today.
That's hilarious.
That's exciting.
I've got a few people in mind in particular, actually.
And so you answered that question in response to Pat's question of how are we going or can we significantly reduce the deficit and spending? So are you saying that by doing that and eliminating a lot of this, let's just call it waste, will that make a difference?
It will make a difference. But here, I want to make one thing very clear up front. We had a period of a few years in the late 1990s and the early part of the following decade where we actually had budget surpluses. We will never see those again. We will never see those again. We will not see a balanced budget. We will not see another surplus in my lifetime. I'm 59 years old. I have planned on living a long life. I want to live to 105 to make my grandchildren's lives miserable, my great-grandchildren's lives miserable, So that would give me 46 years left. I will never see another balanced budget. None of us will ever see a balanced budget again. But here's the good. So that's the bad news. The good news is we don't have to get our fiscal house in order, okay? What we need to do is make sure the debt is either stable or declining relative to GDP. We don't need to bring down the debt. We just need to come down relative to the size of our economy. That would be good enough. So what does it take to do that? Let's cautiously say that the economy, the real economy, can grow 2% a year. Some say more, but I'll just say 2%. And let's say inflation is 2%. It'll probably be higher, but let's just say it's 2. So nominal GDP grows 4% a year. Real growth and inflation combined. Nominal GDP, 4% a year. So if GDP is growing 4% a year, that means the debt can grow 4% a year, okay? So what's the debt? It's $36 trillion. So what's 4% of 36? It's roughly $1.4 trillion. Okay, so what does that mean? If we run budget deficits in the vicinity of 1.4 trillion, which is smaller than it was last year, it was 1.8 trillion. But if we got the deficit, the annual deficit down to roughly 1.4 trillion, then the debt to GDP ratio would be stable and we'd be okay. Okay, I'm not saying good, but we'd be okay. Okay, we'd be muddling through. And muddling through for the USA might be good enough. We've been doing it for centuries. Okay, so as long as we can find a way to cut spending $400-500 billion a year, or cut the deficit $400-500 billion a year, we'll be all right. Now that said, that's a lot of money. So that impoundment might, under an aggressive president, save $200 billion a year, maybe at most, maybe 100 to 200. We still have to find a lot of spending cuts to do it without tax increases. And the bad news is, we're never going to balance the budget again in any of our lifetimes. None of them, okay? The good news is we don't necessarily have to, but there's still a lot of work to be done to bring us down to a stable debt to GDP ratio.
Okay, I have another exciting question. I love the fact that you put it into perspective that we don't have to get the deficit to Clinton-era surpluses, but if we reduce it by X and we get it more in line with our GDP, that makes a lot of sense. Now, taking a hard turn, Vivek and Elon. Is this a publicity stunt? Will they be able to get anything done in government?
I think they'll be able to get a lot done. I do think they have plans. They will be able to get stuff done, but I don't think they're going to be able to get done quite as much as some libertarian dreamers are hoping. Okay, so we're not going to cut $1 trillion a year out of spending. Remember, you have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, national defense. That's both entitlements and essential spending. All that is essential stuff. Other than that, the rest of the entire budget, the social discretionary spending, is roughly 13 or 14% of the budget. I mean, there's a lot of money to be cut, and they can reshuffle the deck chairs for efficiencies, maybe get all the civil rights attorneys out of the Department of Education and hire some at the Department of Justice instead, and stick them on the colleges that discriminate, and have different types of standards for every different group and identity group in the world. But it's not going to be night and day. They'll save money, but it's not going to be night and day.
Why is it we are in this era of rising entitlements, and how do we minimize that? And what are the pros and cons of rising entitlements?
Okay, I mean, there are a lot of ideas to reduce them. I'm not sure many of them will be taken up. Okay, so on Social Security, I mean, we could raise the retirement age. We could change the benefit formula so it's less generous to upper income beneficiaries. We can index your prior earnings so that everybody gets a little less in retirement than they otherwise would. Maybe they'll work a little longer to make up for that. For Medicare, we could change right now, it's mostly still a fee-for-service program. You need to get a hip replacement, it pays, okay, whatever the going rate is. What they could do is transfer that into more of a program that's more like Obamacare, frankly, which is an insurance premium support program. And that would save a lot of money over time. Same with Medicaid, block granting into the states and changing it into an insurance premium support system. We could save a lot of money there on entitlements. Those are not necessarily things that are going to happen. I wouldn't get your hopes up on Social Security. I think in the end, the solution to the actuarial imbalance in Social Security that they choose will be higher taxes. And that's unfortunate, but that's where they're eventually going to go. They just don't know it yet.
I have a question about that. Can you explain this tariff question in plain English, and what's the benefit? Like, why is this coming about as a benefit to, and especially in relation to taxes?
Okay, so I like to separate the tariff issue into China and everybody else. So Trump is essentially proposing 10% across the board, then an extra 50 on China. So it'd be a total of 60% on China. I don't think that's high enough. Okay. And here's why. They just killed 20 million people with COVID. I don't care whether it came from a lab. I don't care whether it came from the wet market, or although I do suspect the lab more, but I don't know. I don't care. They just killed 20 million people because of what they do over there. They're a potential military rival. And I don't know why we're freely trading with a potential future military rival that's threatening to invade Taiwan, on which much of the rest of the world is dependent for chips. If they want access to the U.S. market, they're going to have to behave. They haven't behaved for quite some time. They steal our intellectual property. This goes back to like the late 1980s. So this is not an economic issue to me. This is geopolitical. Okay, why are we freely trading with a country we might be shooting at and might be shooting at us sometime in the next 10 years? Makes no sense. And yeah, we'll be worse off because we don't have access to their cheap stuff. But they'll be even more worse off. And that's what you want with a potential future military rival. Totally good with me. Geopolitical, not economic. The other 10% tariff on the rest of the world, I have to say I'm not a big fan of it. Okay. I think ultimately Americans will pay more, with one exception. If we're going to use these 10% tariffs to get other countries, our NATO allies, for example, to start spending more on their own national defense, then I think it's a good idea. Or if we're going to leverage these 10% tariffs to say, hey, listen, you have these barriers on us, so we're happy to get rid of this 10% tariff sometime in the future. If you reduce your barriers on us, then that's good. Okay, but there are some countries in the world that really don't have significant barriers on us, in which case we shouldn't be doing this 10% tariff.
There seems to be...
Bottom line, we pay it. We will pay it. U.S. consumers will pay it. That's not awful because we pay all taxes. Okay. Okay. We pay income taxes. We pay consumption good taxes to the states. So the fact that American consumers will be paying this tax doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But I prefer not this 10% across the board tax.
Do you think that Trump tried to get us out of NATO?
I don't think he will, but I really think we need to start thinking hard about what our relationship with NATO is. Let's go back almost 80 years, 75 years essentially. Why did NATO start? Well, we needed to have a collective defense against Soviet Bolshevik totalitarianism spreading into deeper into Central Europe and Western Europe. Okay, so it was mostly democracies, plus Greece, not exactly a democracy at the time, plus Turkey, not exactly a democracy at the time, nor is it today, versus the Soviet Union and its satellites that was dominating in Eastern Europe. It didn't want to be part of that empire, but had been forced to be part of it. So I could totally understand that. But why are we subsidizing Germany and France or the UK and their defense? Like, it doesn't make sense. Those guys are just as authoritarian in many respects as some of the countries we're against. There are people being arrested in the UK now for essentially thought crimes and saying bad stuff about immigrants. Like, I'm not saying what they're saying is right. It might be not. I don't know. Okay. But they should be able to say it. Okay. And so the difference now seems to be we have NATO allies that are authoritarian governments that prevent people from speaking their mind and saying what they want. And then we have Turkey that's an authoritarian, undemocratic government. So it's authoritarians on our side who are democratic and undemocratic. And then on their side, it's undemocratic authoritarians, because Putin's really not a communist or a totalitarian. He doesn't want to dominate Paris. He doesn't want to take over the UK and make them like Putinville, So,
well, the night is young.
So why are we defending them? Like, I could totally understand Poland. Poland seems to be like a free country where people could speak their mind. Hungary.
I have to chime in here, Bob, because you don't see us very often on video, but right now you're speaking Brad's language, and he has a subtle smile on his face.
Yeah,
see that? Look at that! Look at they got the Colgate right there.
I love it. Steam coming, a little steam coming off his head.
You're making his
mustache is twisting.
His conspiracy mental cog will turn right now.
Well, when I say it, I sound crazy, right? I sound like like I should wear a tinfoil hat. And by the way,
the shoe fits.
We've had some great minds. We've had some conversations with some great minds, and it feels like most of them aren't willing to be as outspoken or take the stand that we know needs to be taken. And I love what I'm hearing, man. I dig what you're saying. I love that you have the chutzpah to say it. That's it.
Thank you.
Now, from the geopolitical front, Donald Trump, first day in office, I'm going to end the war between Ukraine and Russia and try to negotiate a deal between Gaza and Israel. What are the chances of this stuff actually coming to fruition?
Okay, so between Ukraine and Russia, the clock is ticking on Zelensky and Ukraine. And I have to say, I'm not like a Tucker Carlson apologist for Putin. I think Putin is the bad guy. Okay. That said, do we have a significant interest in bringing Ukraine into NATO? I don't think so. There's a reason. Ukraine is part of the larger part of Eastern Europe. It's very flat and very fertile. And so that's why it's been this, like it's between the Carpathian and the Ural Mountains to a great extent. And it's just flat and a great piece of land. And because of that, it's cursed because everybody wants it. Okay.
If they were to join NATO from a global economic front, how does that even benefit NATO or the world?
I don't think it does, because it would draw us potentially into a global war. And I don't want that. I think the Ukraine should be allowed to join the EU if it wants. But what's eventually going to happen here sometime in the next year or so is Ukraine, the vast majority of which would still be under Zelensky and the elected government in the Ukraine, is going to have to permanently concede the Crimea to Russia, portions of eastern Ukraine that were often Russian speaking to begin with, and that were basically handed to Ukraine a little more than 100 years ago by Lenin, okay, as part of the politics involving the Reds versus the Whites in the Russian Civil War a little more than 100 years ago. And so that's going to be part of the finish line. If Harris had been president, the Ukraine-Russia war would not still be going on 4 years from now, because the Europeans themselves don't want to continue to finance it, I don't think. So Trump is just going to bring it to a head a little more quickly and tell Zelensky he's got 3 months, 6 months, whatever. And after that, no more arms. And Zelensky is going to read the writing on the wall and get to the bargaining table. And I think the bargain I set out a minute ago is basically where they will eventually go. And I think that's unfortunate. And I think Putin's the bad guy, but sometimes the bad guys win because you weren't capable of defending yourself. Okay. If your next door neighbor is a bully, you have to arm yourself and be prepared for them. And Ukraine wasn't, unfortunately. On Gaza, Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, My best guess, given the State Department appointment, the appointment to the Defense Department, we'll see if that one goes through, is that Trump is going to talk about peace, but he's basically going to take the gloves off of Israel and let them do to the Iranian proxies whatever they think they need to reach a permanent settlement. And I wouldn't even be surprised if 2 years from now, the Iranian regime is done and gone. And I think they're kind of teetering a little bit. So we'll see what happens there. Because I think the Iranian people want the mullahs gone. And they would just need some sort of segue government, maybe the Shah's son, who's now like, in his 60s or maybe 70 years old, can step in and temporarily, kind of like Juan Carlos did in Spain after Franco died, several decades ago in Spain, kind of be a transition government to a more democratic, freely elected government in Iran.
With those geopolitical issues happening, I don't see the equity markets, the U.S. equity market specifically, taking that in a negative way. Prices moving higher, earnings are still going higher, and that's what I depend on the most. Is what's the market doing? The market's betting with its dollars and not really taking these wars very seriously.
I think that's generally true and has been true so far. But I want to leave you with one thought, and it's not unbridled optimism, which is that given where the Shiller adjusted price earnings ratio is, where you take earnings over the previous decade essentially and inflation adjust them and whatever, I'm looking at forward returns over the next decade on U.S. equities, including dividends. So total returns, 7%. Like that's low by historical standards. Not horrible. Certainly not as bad as like 2000 through 2010 when we had negative returns, total returns over a decade. Okay, that was horrible. 7% is not great. I mean, it means your dollar doubles over the course of 10 years, roughly doubles. So it's not horrible. But I think equities are a little overpriced right now.
We were talking earlier this week, Brad, Pat, and I, about earnings decoupling from equity prices during the tech boom and after. And right now we have earnings justifying equity prices. Partially.
Like the highest Shiller price to earnings ratio over the past, 50 some odd years, I think it was 44 or 45 back at the peak of the internet boom. I mean, that was way out of line, okay?
Cisco at 40, that type of a thing.
Bingo. The lowest Shiller price earnings ratio at the bottom of the aftermath of the housing bust, I think it was like 15, 14. Okay.
Probably
we're
lower.
at like 30. Yeah. We're at like 36 right now. We're much closer to that all-time peak than the post or the housing bust bottom. So again, yes, earnings have been good, but I just think equity, like I'm not like with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is saying 3% return annually over the next decade. 3%. Okay.
Can you set the bar low enough?
Yeah. I'm saying
what do they have to sell where they're saying 3%?
Yeah, well, apparently they like bonds right now. So I don't know.
They have too many bonds, evidently, and they're trying to get people to scoop them.
Apparently. Well, with Goldman Sachs, an ulterior motive. I don't want to impute that to a great firm like Goldman Sachs, but it's certainly possible. Okay. But
what did they used to call them? The vampire squid? It's that ethos still lives there, right? Yeah. And now their customer base just became.
I think bottom line is that they probably came to that forecast through an intellectually honest procedure, but it wouldn't shock me if there were an ulterior motive either. Yeah, I'm just looking at it from a fundamental standpoint. We're a little bit frothy. If I'm looking at a total return of 7% over the next decade, and I can get close to 4.5 locked in, and if I buy a zero coupon a bit higher than that over the next decade. I'm not going to be aggressive on equities. I'm not going to be out of equities, but I'm not going to be aggressive on equities right now either.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order, Bradley?
I love it.
Well, Brad is very much still interested in the de-dollarization and BRIC currencies.
Not going to happen. So not going to happen.
Okay, here's my very short thought on this, which is that in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and the U.S. dollar is the one-eyed currency. Okay, we don't have to be perfect. We could be a little bit off. But as long as we're so much better than everybody else, long-term expectations, we're okay. No one's going to take our place. Like, are you going to use the currency issued by the Communist Party of China? Are you going to use the currency issued by the Eurozone, which, like, every time there's a financial crisis every 15 years or so, people are going to wonder whether the Eurozone is going to break up. So who's going to take our place? Like Bitcoin? Governments are jealous gods. And if Bitcoin and other crypto were really taking the place of the dollar, they'd come in with a slew of regulations to prevent it. So I think we're just stuck with the US dollar, as good as it is or as bad as it is, as the best that there is in the generation to come.
So one last question regarding Venezuela and their election. What's going to be, from a geopolitical perspective, what do you believe is going to happen, and how do you think that impacts energy prices?
Wait, the next election, or like this election that just happened?
The one that just happened.
Okay, so I mentioned liquefied natural gas hubs earlier, and I think natural gas prices are going to be up a few years from now because we're going to be exporting more to the rest of the world and won't be trapped inside the U.S. And overall, it'll be good for the U.S., but if you're a consumer, you won't like it that much. But I think oil prices will likely be lower 4 years from now than they are today.
All right, gentlemen. Any other questions for Mr. Stein?
Thank you, Bob.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, have a good day.
Thanks for listening to the Sage Planning Solutions podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. If you want more information, visit our website at sageplanningsolutions.com.